Well, here, the first thing I'm seeing is the dad taking that heavy sigh as soon as he asked that question. And I think what we're seeing there is it's almost like, okay, here we go. He's done it quite a few times at this point. We're 3 weeks in after she's been missing.
From the very first seconds of the interview, Gerry McCann draws in a long, heavy breath. It's not theatrical, not staged. It's the sound of a man bracing himself for something he has been forced to relive over and over again. That sigh, quiet but weighted, carries the entire tragedy of what happened 3 weeks earlier when his 3-year-old daughter, Madeleine, vanished without a trace from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz. What would you expect from two parents in such a nightmare? Tears that don't stop, voices cracking with panic, desperate pleas to the camera, begging whoever might be watching to bring their child back. Instead, the world saw something else: composure, calmness, and even faint smiles. Was this a shock response? Two doctors suppressing their emotions the only way they knew how? Or was it a subtle signal that something was wrong from the very beginning? That question became the driving force behind an extraordinary analysis. 4 of the world's most respected experts in body language and behavioral forensics, Greg Hartley, Chase Hughes, Mark Bowden, and Scott Rouse, would dissect every frame, every flicker of expression, every breath. Their goal was not to accuse, but to uncover what was unsaid. This interview mattered because it came before the rehearsals, before media training and carefully crafted statements. It was raw, the so-called baseline behavior that investigators prize above all else, the unfiltered reactions before people learn how to polish their story. For analysts of human behavior, it was a rare and invaluable glimpse into how two parents truly responded when the unthinkable became real. And from that very moment, with a sigh that seemed to echo across the world, questions began to multiply, questions that remain unanswered to this day. 3 weeks had passed since the disappearance of Madeleine McCann from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. In that short but agonizing span of time, headlines exploded across the globe. Millions already knew her name. Theories spread like wildfire. And yet, amid the chaos of speculation, one moment stood apart: the McCann's first televised interview, unfiltered by their press team, where every word and gesture would be scrutinized not just by the public, but by seasoned behavioral experts. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Law enforcement and forensic psychologists often look for what they call baseline behavior. It's the purest version of someone's reaction before they've had the chance to rehearse, rationalize, or refine their answers. Once lawyers and PR advisors step in, narratives become polished. But this early interview, conducted before the heavy machinery of media strategy took full control, offered something rare: a chance to see the parents' rawest, most instinctive responses. When asked to recall the moment he discovered Madeleine was missing, Gerry exhaled with that deep, deliberate sigh, a sound that seemed to prepare him to walk again through a corridor of trauma. Experts described it as the body's natural ramp-up, like reaching the top of a roller coaster just before the plunge. His words, however, carried the cadence of a physician, structured, linear, calm. He sounded less like a father in torment and more like a cardiologist delivering grave news to a patient. Beside him, Kate appeared fragile, her frame small against the backdrop of the interview setting. She held tightly onto a soft toy, reportedly Madeleine's doll, clutching it not as a barrier, but as an anchor, something tangible in the fog of grief. Her voice, brittle and low, cracked at times, as though each word threatened to unravel her. Analysts noted what they called the guilt muscle, a subtle curve between her eyes and lips, often seen in those experiencing profound sorrow. Yet her eyes told a different story. Rather than engaging with the interviewer or looking outward for connection, her gaze dropped down and to the side, classic signals of internal processing. She seemed lost in her own world, navigating a private storm of grief. It contrasted sharply with Gerry's polished composure, the divergence between their demeanors growing starker as the interview unfolded. For the experts watching, this contrast was more than stylistic. It raised the haunting question: were we witnessing trauma expressed in two different ways, or something else entirely? Most grieving parents, they noted, plead into the camera, desperate for help. They speak of their child's suffering, their terror at what the child might be enduring. But Gerry and Kate did not. They did not describe Madeleine's fear, her pain, or her need for comfort. They spoke of her beauty, her perfection, always in the past tense. This was not just an interview, it was a mirror held up to two parents in the darkest chapter of their lives. And the reflection it revealed was as unsettling as the mystery itself. The most striking element of the McCann's interview was the emotional gulf between Gerry and Kate. Sitting side by side, their reactions seemed almost to belong to different worlds. Gerry's answers came out calm, structured, and deliberate. His tone never wavered, his body remained composed, his hands rested without fidgeting. It was the language of logic, the voice of a physician trained to deliver bad news with clarity. To some, it was professionalism under pressure. To others, it was chilling detachment. Kate, in contrast, spoke little. When she did, her words carried a fragile brittleness, like glass on the edge of breaking. She rarely looked into the camera, rarely met the interviewer's gaze. Instead, her eyes drifted downward, inward, searching for stability within herself. Her grip on Madeleine's doll was constant, as if that small stuffed figure was the only tether holding her together. Analysts described her posture not as defensive, but withdrawn, the body of someone folding in on itself. And yet, despite this visible frailty, what was missing were the expected bursts of anguish. There were no surges of anger toward a possible abductor, no desperate appeals for help, no raw pleas that Madeleine be returned. The words Kate did speak were soft, contained, and carefully measured. Gerry, meanwhile, never allowed a crack in his voice, never stumbled, never lost composure. Together, they presented an image of sadness, but sadness that felt controlled, almost anesthetized. Behavioral experts pointed out the dissonance. In cases of parental loss, there is no single script for grief. Some collapse entirely, others go numb. But what troubled analysts here was the lack of variety, the absence of emotional spikes that naturally emerge even in the most stoic individuals. Instead of visible grief, there was a flat line, a steady hum of control without the tremors of desperation. This difference between intellect and emotion became more pronounced as the interview went on. Gerry's language leaned on reason, referencing safety, probabilities, and rational explanations. Kate's contributions were minimal, but even then, her words floated in the past tense. She was beautiful. She was perfect. Not she is, not she needs us, but she was. That linguistic shift disturbed many observers. Experts labeled it temporal disconnection, the unconscious framing of a missing child as though she were already gone. It was not definitive proof of guilt, nor even of knowledge, but it suggested an emotional detachment, intentional or not, from the hope that Madeleine might still be alive. For the public, watching these contrasts side by side, the impression was jarring. Gerry, polished and articulate, seemed at times like a spokesman for a cause. Kate, visibly frail, seemed present but muted. Together, they created not a portrait of grieving parents as the world expected, but something else entirely. A pair of individuals caught between personal tragedy and public performance, their emotions too controlled to reassure, too flat to comfort, and too detached to silence suspicion. If the emotional flatness of the McCanns unsettled experts, it was their behavior outside the interview that truly ignited public suspicion. Just 48 hours after reporting their daughter missing, Gerry and Kate were seen back on the tennis courts at the Ocean Club Resort. To them, it may have been a desperate attempt to grasp at normality, to distract themselves from unbearable reality. But to the watching world, it looked like callousness. How could grieving parents pick up a racket and play while their child was missing? That single image triggered outrage, and the perception of cold detachment began to take hold. Then came Gerry's comment that would haunt the case for years. Madeleine was born with a rare coloboma in her right eye, a distinctive black mark in her iris. Portuguese authorities had reportedly warned the McCanns not to publicize this detail, fearing that if a kidnapper knew the child was too identifiable, they might choose to eliminate the evidence, Madeleine herself. Yet, against this advice, the McCanns released a widely circulated photograph highlighting the defect. When Gerry later referred to it as a great marketing tool, the world recoiled. To describe his missing daughter's unique eye condition in the language of branding felt cold, calculated, and deeply unsettling. Behavioral analysts seized on the phrase. It was more than clumsy wording. It revealed a striking cognitive dissonance. Gerry openly acknowledged the danger, that publicizing Madeleine's eye could put her life at risk, yet justified it by calling it a tool, as though the campaign outweighed the potential consequences. Delivered without visible conflict or regret, his words sounded less like those of a desperate father, and more like those of a man managing a brand. For many observers, the moment crystallized a growing unease. It wasn't simply about whether the McCanns were guilty or innocent. It was about the way they appeared to prioritize image management over raw, unfiltered grief. Instead of pleas for help, there were press conferences. Instead of chaotic emotions, there was composure. Instead of rage at a possible abductor, there were carefully chosen words. To the public, this was not the script of devastated parents. It was the posture of professionals under scrutiny, of strategists maintaining discipline. And whether that discipline was born of trauma, medical training, or something more troubling, it left the world questioning, where was the anguish, the fury, the desperate humanity that should have burst through? In the weeks that followed, the McCanns' public presence shifted from private grief to polished campaign. Press conferences became routine, their statements carefully coordinated and consistent. A fund, Find Madeleine, was quickly established and registered as a limited company. A logo was designed, stylized to echo the distinct mark in Madeleine's iris. Soon their message was everywhere, appearing in international interviews, glossy posters, and televised appeals. But what the world saw wasn't raw desperation. It was messaging discipline. At the center of this strategy were photographs, images intended not only to show Madeleine's face, but to shape how the public perceived her story. And yet, these very photos raised troubling questions. The so-called pool photo, said to be taken on the afternoon of May 3, 2007. The day Madeleine vanished, shows Gerry by the water with his daughter smiling at his side. On the surface, it's a snapshot of a family holiday. But forensic analysts noted red flags. The metadata, the digital fingerprint embedded in most images, was never released. Without it, the date and time cannot be verified. Lighting in the photo seemed inconsistent with the reported hour, and both Kate's and Madeleine's clothing matched outfits seen in earlier pictures. Was the image truly from that fateful day? Or was it chosen or even staged to fit a timeline? The tennis photo sparked similar doubts. Madeleine appears cheerful on a tennis court, but analysts questioned whether the image was altered, with her figure possibly inserted onto the background. Again, no original version or metadata was released. Then there was the red dress photo, perhaps the most iconic image of Madeleine, smiling directly at the camera in a bright dress, an angelic portrait. But it had been taken 1 to 2 years earlier, not during the holiday. Why, critics asked, would the family rely on outdated images rather than recent ones that better reflected her appearance at the time she vanished? To investigators, these choices hinted at a controlled narrative. Photos in missing child cases are meant for recognition, clear, recent, unvarnished. But the McCann images looked curated, polished, emotionally loaded. They conveyed not just who Madeleine was, but how the public should feel about her. The focus, analysts warned, seemed to shift from finding a child to managing perception. When combined with Gerry's marketing tool remark, the photo strategy fueled suspicions that the campaign was less about recovery and more about reputation. Each picture became not only a reminder of Madeleine's absence, but also a symbol of the calculated effort to control her story. To unravel the puzzle of the McCanns' behavior, 4 renowned experts known collectively as the Behavior Panel, Scott Rouse, Greg Hartley, Chase Hughes, and Mark Bowden, undertook a frame-by-frame review of the first televised interview. These were not casual commentators. Between them, they had interrogated war criminals, trained intelligence agents, advised government units, and spent decades decoding human behavior under stress. If anyone could find hidden truths in silence, posture, or word choice, it was this group. They began with the basics, the universal markers of deception. Liars often shield vulnerable areas like the throat, avoid eye contact, shift their gaze suddenly, or cross their arms as barriers. They stumble over words, repeat themselves, or switch pronouns mid-sentence. Yet none of these cues appeared in the McCanns' responses. Gerry and Kate's eye contact was steady. Their voices didn't crack. They didn't over-justify their choices or try to prove their innocence with resume statements like, "We're good parents, we'd never hurt her." In fact, their restraint made them harder, not easier to read. What stood out instead was the emotional void. The panel described it as an emotional flatline. There were no tears, no tremors in their voices, no slumped shoulders. Even when recalling the night their daughter vanished, neither Gerry nor Kate betrayed the chaos one would expect from grieving parents. Their tone was steady, their expressions neutral, their movements minimal. They weren't defensive, they weren't panicked, but they also weren't devastated. Mark Bowden noted the absence of dramatization. "We don't see them trying to act," he observed. "There's no 'please believe me' language. That makes me think they're not lying." Chase Hughes agreed, adding, "If they're faking this, they're the best actors we've ever seen. But I don't see signs of fake grief either. The real question is, if they're telling the truth, where are the emotions?" Greg Hartley focused on the lack of fear. He saw sadness in Kate, yes, but not the horror of imagining what Madeleine might be enduring if still alive. "I don't see fear," he remarked, "and that matters." Scott Rouse summarized the panel's conclusion bluntly. "I don't see deception, but I also don't see devastation." For the experts, this paradox was haunting. The McCanns didn't fit the mold of liars, but neither did they fit the mold of desperate parents clinging to hope. They occupied a gray space between truth and illusion, a space where silence, control, and restraint spoke louder than words. At the center of the storm stood Gerry McCann, not just a father, but also a respected cardiologist and professor. His profession defined him, calm under pressure, precise in speech, and trained to deliver devastating news without losing composure. In a hospital, such restraint inspires confidence. But in the glare of a missing child case, it looked like detachment. The public expected chaos, yet Gerry offered clarity. They expected trembling grief, but he provided controlled statements. That gap between expectation and reality became one of the deepest sources of suspicion. Beneath his poise, experts identified two forms of guilt. The first was explicit and undeniable. Gerry and Kate had left their 3 children alone in the holiday apartment while dining with friends nearby. It was a decision they would later describe as a mistake, one that, even without malicious intent, carried consequences they could never escape. Phrases like, "We thought it was safe," or "It's what many others did," surfaced in interviews, revealing both regret and the desperate need for self-forgiveness. That visible guilt was understandable, even human, but it was the second layer, the possibility of concealed guilt, that troubled analysts. This did not necessarily imply direct wrongdoing, but it suggested withheld knowledge, details unspoken that, if revealed, might shift the narrative. The indicators were subtle: the refusal to speculate on Madeleine's fear, the lack of vivid emotional descriptions of that night, the avoidance of empathetic projections about what she might be enduring. Instead of dwelling on her pain, Gerry's focus often shifted to media management, public perception, and controlled messaging. Nowhere was this clearer than in his remark, "What's done is done, and we have to move forward." On the surface, it sounded pragmatic, a father trying to cope, but linguists categorized it as absolution language, a phrase designed to close the emotional door, to move from remorse to resolution. Spoken so soon after Madeleine's disappearance, it struck many as premature, detached, even clinical. Behavioral experts noted his delivery: flat tone, steady gaze, no micro-expressions of grief or shame. To some, it revealed a man suppressing trauma through the armor of professionalism. To others, it hinted at deeper truths left unsaid. Whatever the case, Gerry's words and demeanor embodied the paradox of the McCann mystery. Not evidence of deception, but the unsettling absence of the raw humanity that tragedy usually rips to the surface. When the world first saw Gerry and Kate McCann appear on television just weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, people expected anguish. They expected visible breakdowns, tears streaming, voices cracking under the unbearable weight of loss. Instead, what they witnessed was composure, restraint, and almost clinical calm. To some, it was a sign of strength. To others, it was the most chilling detail of all. Forensic analysts could find no clear markers of deception. The McCanns did not display the defensive gestures, erratic speech, or desperate resume statements so common among guilty parents in other high-profile cases. Their narrative was steady, their eye contact consistent, their tone controlled. By the standards of deception detection, they were clean. Yet, paradoxically, that very cleanliness became a problem. Where there was no chaos, no cracks, no messiness of grief, there was also no pulse. The absence spoke louder than words. No furious condemnations of a potential abductor. No trembling appeals into the camera. No speculation about what Madeleine might be enduring, whether she was scared, hurt, or crying out for her parents. Instead, the language remained distant, almost promotional, focusing on how perfect she was, framed repeatedly in the past tense. This is what haunts the case even now. Not what the McCanns said, but what they didn't. Not the evidence of lies, but the void where raw humanity should have been. Was it trauma manifesting as numbness? Was it the detachment of medical professionals conditioned to control their emotions? Or was it something darker, an intentional suppression of truths too dangerous to speak aloud? The experts stopped short of judgment. They offered instead a mirror reflecting silence, restraint, and ambiguity back to the world. And in that reflection, viewers were left to wrestle with their own questions. What do you believe when a father speaks like a spokesman, and a mother clutches a doll in silence? What do you feel when grief looks more like strategy than sorrow? In the end, the McCann case remains a riddle suspended between innocence and suspicion. Perhaps the most terrifying answer lies not in what was revealed, but in what was missing. The unmistakable heartbeat of parental despair. Sometimes, the loudest voice in a tragedy is not a scream, but the silence that follows.